Welcome to Learning with Sprayberry, where we make social studies fun, easy, and educational. This mini-series is focusing on the causes of the Civil War. We're going to break the road to war into a multi-part series comprised of long and short-term causes. So make sure you check out the series to give you a good view of the road to war. Today we're going to focus on the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. I'm sure many of you are asking how a court case led to the Civil War. It's a little bit of a convoluted tale, but trust me, it does. So here's a quick case summary. Dred Scott was a slave who spent a good chunk of his living in servitude but in free states. He attempted to purchase his freedom, but when he was refused, he turned to the legal option to try and get out of slavery. Let's start, as we always do, with a little bit of background. Dred Scott was born in 1795 in Virginia. As a slave, he grew up being owned by Peter Blow, a farmer who moved to Alabama and later to Missouri. Now, once he reached Missouri, Blow sold Scott to Dr. John Emerson, an army doctor. Being in the army meant that Emerson moved around quite a lot. Because Scott was legally property, he moved where Emerson went. Not long after being purchased, Scott moved with Emerson to the free state of Illinois. So Emerson brought a slave into a free state. You'd imagine that the case is solved here. Scott should be free. Not so fast. There's more. Not long after moving to Illinois, Emerson was transferred and moved to the Wisconsin Territory, a free territory under the Missouri Compromise, in what will become eventually Minnesota. During 1836, Scott was married to Harriet Robinson in a ceremony that was overseen by a government official. At the time, this is quite odd because as an enslaved person, his marriage was not legally binding, so why was it overseen by an official? That's a good question that honestly isn't really fully resolved. In 1836, Emerson was ordered to Missouri. While on his way, Emerson left Scott and his wife in Missouri. While they were there, Scott and his wife were leased out for labor. This meant that Scott was actively being used as a slave in Missouri. At the end of 1837, Emerson ended up marrying Irene Sanford. Emerson and the Scott family were moved along with Irene to Louisiana. While on the way, Scott's daughter was born on a steamboat in free territory, technically making her free. The next year, Emerson was ordered back to Minnesota. 2 years later, Irene and the Scotts moved to Minnesota to join him. While Emerson was away at war, Irene leased the Scotts out again. This means that there was slave labor in a free state. And in 1840, she moved back to St. Louis, Missouri, along with the Scotts. Now, in 1842, Dr. Emerson finally left the army only to die a year later, leaving the Scotts in his will to Irene. Now, she continued to lease the Scotts out for an additional 3 years as hired labor. In 1846, Scott attempted to purchase his freedom from Irene Sanford, but she refused, leaving Dred Scott the only option available, which was the legal option. His initial lawsuit was brought in the state of Missouri in 1846. His primary argument relied on the fact that he was a slave that had been held and leased out for labor in a free state. Technically illegal, meaning he should be free. The case was lost due to a technicality that was essentially he couldn't prove that he was enslaved in a free territory. The judge stated, matter-of-factly, that he probably would have won if he could have proved the argument. With that being the case, Scott was granted a retrial in 1847, but due to many issues in the state, it didn't start until 1850. While waiting on the case to start, Scott and his family were put in the custody of a Missouri sheriff while his labor was still being leased out. During the time, Irene Sanford had moved to the north and transferred ownership of Scott and his family to her brother John Sanford. And in 1852, the case was finally determined and it was ruled against Scott. So this time, Scott decides to instead try his case against John Sanford, his current owner, in 1853. John Sanford had already moved to New York, which led to the case being heard in federal court. The judge presiding over this case instructed the jury who was hearing the case to use Missouri state law as the basis of a case. Missouri is a slave state. Under this set of laws, Scott was ruled a slave. Now, refusing to give up, Scott appeals this decision to the United States Supreme Court. I know what you're thinking. By this point, you can already tell how this case is going to go for Scott. Well, Sorta. The Supreme Court justices were split on the decision, meaning they didn't all agree. But with the Supreme Court, whatever the majority says is how the court decides. 7 of the Supreme Court justices ruled that Scot was a slave, while 2 dissented or disagreed with that ruling. The court's argument was based off the question, can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community? What this means is, can a guy who was bought and sold in the United States ever be part of the United States as a citizen? In what many scholars consider the worst ruled case in the history of the Supreme Court, the court ruled that a black person does not constitute an American citizen, and therefore has no legal standing in court. Taney's decision was honestly riddled with inherent racism. This is a direct quote from the decision. In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights with which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Take a second and let that decision sit in. While delivering this ruling, Chief Justice Roger Taney also took steps to address the Missouri Compromise. He ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and thus completely destroyed the 36-30 line that had divided the territories between free and slave. Furthering his decision, he declared that slaves were to be considered property under the Fifth Amendment. This prevents the federal government from freeing slaves because they are technically private property, and private property is protected under the Fifth Amendment. One of the dissenting opinions was written by Benjamin Curtis. He argued that Judge Taney had overstepped the bounds of the case by ruling on the Missouri Compromise. There was no need to rule on it in a case that dealt with one person. The other dissenting judge, John McLean, argued that black men were citizens already due to the fact that they were granted voting rights by 5 out of 13 states when the Constitution was being ratified. So, besides the fact that Scot didn't win his freedom, why does this case matter? This case features both political and economic consequences. Politically, this case overturned the Missouri Compromise, allowing for the spread of slavery throughout the territories that had previously been protected as free territories. Democrats had been attempting to overturn the Compromise of 1820 for a while, and while the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed, this decision cemented the end of the Missouri Compromise. Additionally, this case brought slavery to the forefront of the political argument. Southern states were suddenly granted much more representational power. If slavery expands, that, mixed with the 3/5 compromise, would allow Southern states to have a much larger representation in the House of Representatives, thus greatly reducing the power of Northern states. Taney's initial decision was to help settle the argument of slavery by settling law, and in this case, unfortunately, he did the exact opposite. The decision that slaves are property and cannot be removed from the owner has some also unintended consequences. Think about this. What happens if a slave owner moves with his slaves to New York, a decidedly free state? Are they still property or are they free? Under this decision, they would still be maintained as slaves in a free state. In fact, it kind of destroys the whole idea of a free or a slave state. If they're your property and you can take them anywhere, technically everywhere is a slave state. Economically, the consequences are a little harder to see. This decision allows for the expansion of slavery into previously free territories. Now keep in mind, the Kansas-Nebraska Act rewrote the Missouri Compromise and granted popular sovereignty, meaning that states can vote for or against slavery. This vote caused people to flood into the territories to try and cast a ballot. And when you combine heavily pro-slavery and heavily anti-slavery forces, you're going to get some violence. What does this have to do with economics? I know you're asking. Railroads that had been expanding into western territories suddenly stopped expansion. Because railroads are such a large industry, people instantly knew the economy was about to start collapsing. With this fear of an economic collapse, people began to pull out their cash from banks. And let's be real, a bank without money can't be a bank. Many of the banks who had had their cash withdrawn shut down, and this sets off the Panic of 1857. Going back to Scot, Irene Sanford eventually remarried. She married Calvin Chaff, a doctor and an abolitionist. Which, kind of ironic, right? Chaff was elected to Congress as a Republican, a member of the anti-slavery political party. But keep in mind, this looks really bad for him because his brother-in-law, Irene's brother, is the owner of one of the most famous slaves in history, Dred Scott. Chaff chose to transfer ownership of Scot to Taylor Blow, a descendant of Scot's first owner. Still doesn't make this case sound any better, right? Well, hold on. Blow decided to emancipate or free Scot on May 26, 1857. So after 11 years of fighting for his freedom using the legal system, Scot finally achieved his goal. Hooray! Unfortunately, you knew this was going to have a turn. It has already. Scot died of tuberculosis 18 months later. Well, that's a way to end this video on a downer. Realistically, there's no way to end a video about slavery on a positive note. Question of the day. In what ways can you argue that the Dred Scott case led, at least in part, to the Civil War? Let me know down in the comments below. Okay, to try to end on somewhat of a positive note, let's do Subscriber of the Week. This week I want to send out a thanks to NovaTrap for watching. I really appreciate it. If you want to be featured as the Subscriber of the Week, it's easy. Subscribe. Thanks for watching Learning with Sprayberry, where we make social studies fun, easy, and educational. If you like what you saw, click like. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. Ring the bell over there to make sure that you receive notifications. I'll see you next time on Learning with Sprayberry.